Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling a topic that's been making waves in the finance world. We're talking about the cash conversion cycle, that's CCC, for those in the know,
The one and only.
and how it just doesn't seem to quite fit when we're talking about businesses that are built on things like subscription models or upfront payments.
Right.
So like your SaaS companies, your subscription boxes. You get the idea.
Yeah, those recurring revenue models everyone's talking about.
Exactly. Now, for our listeners who maybe aren't as familiar with the CCC, it's basically a measure of how long a company takes to turn its inventory, its raw materials, products, whatever it might be, into actual cash. And generally, shorter is better.
Absolutely. The faster you can convert inventory to cash, the better your cash flow. And it usually means you're running a tighter ship.
Exactly. And then there's the Holy Grail, a negative CCC. That's when a company is actually getting paid by customers before having to pay its own suppliers.
Talk about a cash flow dream, right?
It's like having your cake and eating it too. But that's kind of where things get a little murky when we start applying this traditional CCC thinking to businesses that are getting paid up front for things like software or services. And that's why we're so fortunate to have our expert here to kind of unpack all of this for us. So before we really deconstruct things and see where the traditional CCC goes off the rails, could you give us a little bit of a refresher on how this metric typically works? Like, what are the building blocks of the CCC?
Absolutely. Happy to break it down. So think of the traditional CCC as a timeline with three major pit stops. You've got DIO, DSO, and DPO. So first up, DIO, that's days inventory outstanding. Basically, this tells you how long, on average, inventory sits on a company's shelves before it's actually sold.
Okay, so it's all about how efficiently they're moving those products.
Exactly. Then you've got DSO, days sales outstanding. That measures how long it takes to actually collect payment from customers after a sale has been made. Are customers paying their invoices on time?
So it's about managing those customer relationships and making sure that cash is coming in smoothly.
You got it. And then finally, there's DPO, days payables outstanding, which looks at how much time a company takes to pay its own bills, to its suppliers. It's like the flip side of DSO.
So it's about leveraging those supplier relationships to manage their own cash flow.
Exactly. So you add that DIO and DSO together, you subtract the DPO, and voila, you've got yourself the cash conversion cycle.
Okay, that's a great refresher. But I think it's time we get to the heart of the matter here. Where does this traditional CCC model start to unravel when we're dealing with businesses that are getting paid up front?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. It really comes down to the very nature of what's being sold and how the payment structure works. Think about a classic example, like a furniture maker. They have raw materials, they build furniture, they sell that furniture, and hopefully they get paid. Their CCC is a really good reflection of how efficiently they're managing that whole flow of, inventory to sales to payments. But now let's switch gears to a SaaS company, right? They're selling software subscriptions. Are they shipping boxes of code? I don't think so.
That would be a sight to see.
It would be an interesting logistics operation, to say the least. But the point is, their inventory, if you can even really call it that, it's more like a long-term asset, right?
Right, they build it once, and then it's out there in the digital ether.
Exactly. And to make things even more interesting, they're often collecting those subscription payments up front, sometimes even years in advance.
So it's like comparing apples and, lines of code.
It's like comparing a hammer to a cloud. I mean, they're just fundamentally different things.
They are.
Yeah.
And that's where it seems like this traditional CCC formula might not be telling us the whole story.
You got it. The traditional CCC, it really struggles to wrap its head around concepts like deferred revenue, which is that money a company has received but hasn't really earned yet because they haven't provided the service. And prepaid expenses, these are kind of like, the secret sauce of these business models. And yet, the traditional CCC kind of glances over them.
So it's like we need a software update for our accounting software, or at least a new perspective.
And that's where I think Mr. Schmidt really hits the nail on the head. He makes this really interesting argument, right? He says, ignoring deferred revenue, ignoring prepaid expenses, that's like pretending those things don't have a huge impact on a company's actual cash on hand.
It's like saying, just because you don't technically own that $100 your friend promised you next week, doesn't mean it's not influencing how much you're spending today.
Yeah, exactly. You're already factoring it into your budget, right?
Yeah.
It's about the reality of the cash flow, not just what some accounting rulebook says. And I think that's where his proposed modifications to the traditional CCC formula are so interesting.
Okay, so walk us through it. How does he want to adjust things?
So he's got a couple of key adjustments. Primarily, he wants to look at DSO and DPO and make some tweaks there.
Makes sense. Those seem like the most logical places to start, given what we've been talking about. So how's he tweaking DSO?
So with DSO, remember, that's all about how long it takes to collect payments. So he suggests we should subtract deferred revenue from the accounts receivable when we're calculating that.
Because you've already got that cash in hand, essentially.
Right. You're not really waiting around to collect on that revenue, are you? It's like giving them credit, literally, in the calculation for managing that cash flow well.
It's like a reward for good behavior. I like it. So what about DPO? How does that factor in?
So similar thinking with DPO, we need to consider those prepaid expenses. Because if you've already paid your suppliers up front, it's like getting this extended payment term, right?
Yeah, it's like you're playing with house money for a bit.
Exactly. And that's a good thing when we're talking about maintaining a healthy CCC, right? You want to hold on to your cash as long as possible.
Right. Makes perfect sense. It's all starting to click for me now. It's like he's really highlighting how these traditional metrics failed to capture the time advantage that these subscription or these upfront payment models can create.
Exactly. It's like giving credit where credit is due.
Literally.
Literally. And I think he's onto something important here, you know? By taking deferred revenue into account, by taking prepaid expenses into account, we get this much clearer, much more accurate picture of how these businesses are really managing their cash, you know? Not just what's reflected on some standardized balance sheet.
See, this is what I love about these deep dives. It's like we're really peeling back the layers and understanding the nuance here. And Mr. Schmidt, he didn't stop there, did he? He took it a step further with this whole idea of DIO.
Oh, he went there.
He went there. He went full radical, didn't he?
Full radical. He proposed a zero DIO for those pure float businesses, you know, like your SaaS companies.
That's right. Zero, as in non-existent. That's a bold move, Mr. Schmidt. Tell me more. So we've really gone deep on the numbers, haven't we? Exploring Mr. Schmidt's proposed adjustments to the cash conversion cycle and even kind of pondering the very nature of what we even consider inventory in today's digital world. But I think what I'm left wondering is, what's the big takeaway? You know, for someone listening to this, trying to make sense of it all, how does this change the way we look at these businesses?
Right. It's about connecting the dots, isn't it? And what Mr. Schmidt is highlighting is that by using a modified CCC, one that considers deferred revenue, considers prepaid expenses, and maybe even includes this idea of a zero DIO, we're actually unlocking a whole new level of understanding about these businesses. It's not just about the numbers themselves, but what they're really telling us.
It's like we're trading in our old magnifying glass for one of those fancy financial microscopes. We're seeing things in a whole new light.
I like that. I like that a lot. And what we start to see through this new lens is incredibly valuable, especially for investors, because it helps us spot those companies that are absolutely crushing it when it comes to managing their cash flow. Companies that might not even, you know, set off any alarm bells if you just looked at their traditional CCC.
And we're talking about finding those hidden champions, right? The ones quietly building those competitive moats through the power of smart cash management.
Absolutely. And it makes you think about how a traditional company might achieve a really strong CCC, right? Maybe they have fantastic relationships with their suppliers, you know, they can negotiate those favorable terms. That gives them a real edge.
Right, it's all about leverage. And in the world of SaaS, in this world of these subscription models, this modified CCC, it becomes kind of a measure of a different type of advantage, doesn't it?
For sure. It really highlights the strength of their underlying business model, right? Their ability to secure those upfront payments and then use that cash flow essentially as fuel to just keep growing and growing.
So are we saying that companies with these subscription models are essentially getting like a free loan from their customers by managing cash flow in this way?
You know, it's an interesting way to think about it, and it highlights why understanding these dynamics is so crucial, especially for investors, right? By recognizing these factors, you can really start to separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. Identify those companies that aren't just surviving, but thriving in this landscape.
This has been a true deep dive. We went from the very basics of the cash conversion cycle to exploring how this metric might need to evolve to keep up with the times. A huge thanks to Mr. Schmidt for giving us so much to think about.
My pleasure. I always enjoy digging into these evolving financial models.
And to our listeners, we leave you with this. Remember that Mr. Schmidt's ideas, these proposed modifications to the CCC, they're just that, proposals, really meant to get the conversation going. Encourage us all to think critically about whether the tools we're using, are they still serving us well as these business models change and evolve at an ever-increasing pace. So As you follow different companies, ask yourself, does this new lens, this adjusted CCC, does it change how I view their financial health? Are there other ways we could be looking at these numbers? Really understanding the underlying dynamics at play. Keep those questions in mind, and you'll be well on your way to making those informed decisions. Until next time, keep diving deep.